Yep.
Good morning. It is Tuesday, March 29th, 2022. We are here in the chambers for a regular commissioner board meeting with 3 commissioners all present, the administrator and the clerk of the board. And at this time, I'll call the meeting to order, and if you'd please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, the first item on the agenda is the approval of meeting minutes from February 23rd, March 8th, and March 15th. Is there any additions, corrections? No. Okay, next is vouchers, approval of vouchers.
We have one today, fund expenditures. Move for approval of fund expenditures in a total amount of $714,557.22 as presented, and note that it has been reviewed and signed by 2 representatives of the auditor's office and the county administrator.
Second.
There's been a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Next was the consent agenda, and there's 9 items on the consent agenda this morning.
Move for approval of consent agenda items 1 through 9 as presented.
Second. Discussion.
There's been a motion and a second for the 9 items on the consent agenda with discussion. Go ahead, Commissioner Peck.
We'll just take these in order that they're listed on the agenda. First one is the Johnson Controls. And Keith, who is the proponent for this one? I don't recall offhand.
That would be the Juvenile Justice Center, Darrell Banks.
Okay. I don't see anybody here, so I'll just hit this quickly and move on. It references an Exhibit B, and it says that there's no fiscal impact. What I was hoping is that because this is a shared expense between the 2 counties, we'd have some idea of how much they spent on this contract in the past and what drives the cost. I think it's based on how much we call them out for services, and the reason the amount of services used is important to me is because this facility is in rapid decline, and it's one of the costs that we've looked at, excuse me, our specialty contracts to help justify getting money from the state to build a new facility. So that data, those data are always helpful, but I don't see anybody here to discuss that, so we'll move on to item 3, which was the mutual use on the jail facilities, and the question I didn't see addressed, and I suppose I can understand it doesn't have to be, but I'm curious, do we have a sense of whether or not this produces a net revenue to Franklin County or a net cost, or is that an unknown based on the fact that in any given year we don't know which county is going to provide housing services more to the other? Is that, Sheriff, is that a reasonable?
That's reasonable. In this instance, this contract is just a swap of time.
Sheriff, it might be best if you came to the mic so we could hear everybody could hear you, please.
So I don't believe there will be any cost one side or the other. We're just simply trading bed space with Benton County. And it's basically used for when you have inmates that they're at risk if they're in one facility versus the other facility, and it's just a swap straight across.
It tends to balance out, doesn't it?
It does,
That was
yeah.
my recollection,
Yeah,
but,
what happens if we had contracts signed between each other, I think we're at a bed rate of $87 a day now, but Benton County's is much higher than that, and so it would have been lopsided, if you would, if you were charging them for our services. They're only being charged $87 a day versus if we had an inmate over there, we'd be somewhere north of $100 a day. So it's just a swap is what it is.
yeah, we had a big decline in revenue from us housing DOC and other people's inmates in our jail for a time, and then that revenue tapered off dramatically, and I realize that's a little bit different issue than this.
Right.
Have we recovered any of that revenue stream, or?
Yes,
Okay.
we have contracts in place with the Department of Corrections where we hold DOC offenders in our jail, and they appropriately pay us at whatever the state rate is, which is 87, I think.
Yeah, and we're still providing that service or charging those fees to Pasco as well, right?
Yep, it's
Yeah.
the same fees for everybody, yes.
Okay, and then the last thing real quick was that the Rita Heads talked about Section 22, which is the extension of time under the contract. It referenced to Section 21, which was the termination clause. To your recollection, there's no change in those termination terms. It's pretty much the same as last time.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Sheriff, one question for me is should we be looking at raising our rate from 87?
Well, you really actually can't raise your rate anymore. It's set by the state. So each time the state comes out with a daily bed rate, that's what you end up charging, and that's how you alter the contracts, is based on the state's rate, right?
How is Benton County's different from ours?
I don't know how it is that they got as high as they did, but I'm suspecting that they're actually going to get rolled back to whatever that state rate is, right?
Okay, thank you.
So, just in general, so that our population, jail population, went down during COVID.
Yep.
We tried to keep the numbers at 150 or below, but once all restrictions were off, we're averaging somewhere north of 200 inmates a day in our facility, with bed space for about 330. So we still have room, but our daily count population is going up now.
And that bed space includes the renovation of the old jail space that's done, correct?
Yep, it's all done.
Yep. Good job.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, Sheriff, you may want to stand by for the next one, which is the body cam redaction. I realize this package didn't come from you, it came from Mr. Johnson. And just a quick question. The recommended rate is 44 cents a minute for redaction services. You provided a bunch of comparators from around the state, which were literally all over the map, literally and figuratively. But we settled on 44 a minute, which looks like it's toward the very bottom end. And I'm going to just assume that you wouldn't have presented that if you didn't think that would cover our costs.
That's correct.
And so really the issue here is the disparity between costs of our employees versus the ones in Spokane or Skagit or somewhere.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. That was all I had on that one. And the last one, Mr. Wyatt, is here. This is on the corrections deputies 8 and 9. In your read ahead, you said that there was no fiscal impact, and I was just going to ask if in the future maybe you could think of something more like first year fiscal impact will be easily offset by the savings from vacant positions, because the fact is when we bring somebody in at say a step 3, they immediately move up the step scale at an accelerated rate, their 3-year head start. And so there is a fiscal impact to the county, and it's a fiscal impact that continues as long as they work for the county. So not to confuse anybody, I think that these are entirely appropriate requests. I don't have a problem supporting them, but lately I've been noticing an awful lot of no fiscal impact on packages when in fact there is fiscal impact. So just a request if you sort of factor that in, and if you agree, start giving us a little different perspective on the fiscal impact.
Yeah, of course, I can
Okay.
reflect that in
All
there
right.
going forward.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second for action, for consent agenda items 1 through 9. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Move down to the Commissioner Administrator updates. Keith?
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Participated in the Wasac Virtual Assembly call yesterday. It was primarily just an update from most of the counties that were on the call of kind of some of the major issues that they're dealing with. We find some pretty significant commonality between what's going on in Franklin County and other counties trying to adopt legislation that was recently passed, dealing with plans for the Rescue Plan Act funding that counties have received, and a number of other similar issues. Last week, I was fortunate to be able to participate with TriDec and the folks from the Tri-Cities community. We had a tour with the leadership of the Umatilla tribe. This was put together by David Replug, who's here today on another matter, one of the many hats that he wears for Franklin County. Put that tour together where we viewed many of the shoreline reconveyance issues in both Benton and Franklin counties with the impacted jurisdictions and the tribe. Had a great discussion, answered some questions, got kind of a on-the-ground feel for what the different jurisdictions are requesting and how the tribe may be able to support those requests. There's still some runway to cover with federal legislation, but those conversations are continuing and that planning is moving forward successfully. Still working on receiving applications for the Mental Health Substance Use Advisory Committee. I received about 7 different applications so far. We have until the end of April open for those nominations or applications to come in, and then we'll bring those suggestions to the board for confirmation. Working on a couple of meetings with the HAPO credit union team on restarting their ATM project out at the HAPO Center. That was an agreement that we reached with them when we offered them the naming rights. COVID kind of put them in a stall for that for the last couple of years, but now we're bringing that project back. That they should be starting on that this spring. That's most of what I've been doing the last week, anyway.
Commissioner Peck.
So following a meeting last week, I left for the Washington County's Risk Pool. This is the first in-person conference I can recall attending in the last 2.5 years. It was good, but a little different to be sitting in a room with 100 other people. The Risk Pool is the organization that we belong to, along with the majority of the counties in the state that provide an insurance pool. And just by way of quick update, the cost of insurance of all types is going up. No surprise there, especially the cost of cyber coverage. Over the years that I've been here, when Commissioner Cook before me was on this board, we looked at whether or not there was wisdom in going outside of this pool, and I will say that every time that we studied it, it was clear that the Washington County's risk pool is indeed a good value for us, and we have a lot of say in it, having both our risk manager, Jennifer Johnson, and a board member, myself, on their board. Had the WASAC weekly meeting yesterday, which was one of the roundtables. We didn't have a particular guest presenter, but instead we had counties bring up issues that they were working with and struggling with, and no surprise, most of the county's issues mirrored what we see and what we deal with, so no need to go into a lot of detail there. Council of Government staff meeting on a citizen proposal. Actually, a group of citizens have come forward that would like us to help facilitate a project to put updated, efficient LED multicolored lighting on the cable bridge as a marketing idea, and then follow up yesterday with the AFIC board on some pending loan activities. Thanks.
Commissioner Mullen?
Last week, we had the TRIDEC board meeting. Also sat in on the WASAC meeting yesterday. Also had a meeting with Keith, discussion on just different opportunities that are in functions that are happening in the county. An update on the Wilson House. It's still for sale, but waiting to get some clarification on conditional use permits from the city. Also want to note that the Planning Commission still has openings if there's people interested in that. To please see Derek Bratton. Other than that, might note that to preserve our county roads, the studs come off April 1st, so to try to avoid any fines, I want to make sure everybody's aware of that and get those taken off if you still have them. So that's it.
Thank you. Last week, I had the Port of Pasco meeting, and then the Eastern Washington Council of Governments meeting. And one thing that was discussed there that was eye-opening was the fact that our state is moving ahead and implementing, I guess, an agenda without the input from the local governments, and they're not too happy about it. I was well-versed on the meeting. I got a couple emails and phone calls. We had a couple people fall down the stairs in the courthouse, and it was my understanding that we need a direction. We need a plan for this. It seems to be an occurrence that's happening, and I don't know if we need to rope those stairs off and make everybody use the elevator, because when they get on their cell phones or whatever, maybe an elderly person, we need to take caution with those stairways. They seem to be hard to maneuver for some people, and they're falling down them. So, and then I got a phone call from a resident that was very alarmed at the fact that they put in a couple H2A housing units by his house. He called me and asked, he says, well, Clint, you know, when anybody subdivides off a piece of their property, they've got to send out an information letter to all the neighbors. Well, now they're building 6 more units by his house, and he's wondering where this information unit. And so I asked Derek to please come in and inform us about this. So Derek, if you'd come forward and tell what is the H2A program and how influential are we as a county on it?
Unfortunately, not very.
We have no say.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
Oh.
I didn't realize I was that close to the mic. I was just saying to myself, we have literally no say. But
Pretty
building
much.
setbacks,
Yeah, H2A housing, or what they call temporary worker housing in Washington, is actually regulated by the Department of Labor and Industries, the Employment Security Department, and then the U.S. Department of Labor. So they're the ones who prepare a list of standards that these units have to meet. They're based on a HUD standard, not the building code. And the only things, so the state's got RCW 70.114A050, which reads temporary worker housing located on this one's going to be hard for me to keep saying, rural work site, it's a tongue twister, and used for workers employed on the work site shall be considered a permitted use at the rural work site for the purpose of zoning or other land use review processes, subject only to height, setback, and road access requirements of the underlying zone. So what happens normally, but I can't say 100%, is with certain types of these housing, we receive a request where we produce a zoning letter, and that zoning letter basically describes the project, provides the setback and height limits, and then states, as proposed, this farm worker housing does not comply with Franklin County development regulations for farm worker housing. However, it quotes the RCW and basically reiterates the fact that we have no say except for the height. So we review it for those items. And that's really the only control we have. It's fully regulated, investigated, inspected. There are complaint lines. There is a process, and I'm more than happy to provide that information, or I can tell you, but it's a website and a phone number. But that's generally envisioned not for the sighting, but due to activities at the property, like they're disturbing people or those types of things. But again, even that, we're not involved in that enforcement.
So we have residents that have purchased property, that are paying property taxes, that are having H-2A housing moved in beside them, and actually hurting their valuation, not on our paper, but on resale, and we have no say in it.
Pretty much, yep. As long as it meets the requirements of the
I think as
law.
a county, we need to send a complaint letter to the state that we should have more influence on this H-2A housing and where it is placed in our county. This is not right.
This is not the first time we've had this issue. It's been a long sore spot with the state that,
Well, I think a letter,
Yeah.
a disgruntled letter from the county board of commissioners would be, and maybe some other, I'll call some other counties. We should have influence on where this housing is placed. It shouldn't be just pushed into our county wherever they feel like putting it.
Well, for example, when we do the housing for family, farm housing for family or permanent hired help, there's a regulation, whereas, you know, the main farmhouse or the farmer has to be within 1 mile of that location. I would have to really dig in to see if that also applies there. There may be some proximity limitations, but as long as they meet our required setbacks, which are generally, in this case, 25 feet in the front, 10 feet, or actually usually out there it's going to be 20 because there's no fire hydrants, and they meet the height requirement of less than 35 feet. At this point, our hands are tied. We have no ability to.
I'd encourage you to-
I don't even have the right to enforce code enforcement actions.
I'd encourage you to dig into that a little bit more, and I would encourage a letter from the Board of Commissioners if the other commissioners are in agreement.
So we've dealt with this issue for a number of years. Some of these housing projects have been advocated for and built by members of our farm community, active local farmers. The most recent one was near the intersection of Sagemore and Columbia River, where Sagemore turns away from the river, just right where Larkspur hits Sagemore. On the north side of that, Allen Brothers built a facility there for cherry harvest workers. And we dug into this pretty deeply at the time. We had lots of conversations with the state, and change is always possible. In this case, it would take a new law from the legislature, as I understand it, because this is embedded in statute. Not opposed to raising the issue, just letting folks know we've raised it before, and it's going to take legislative help. Thanks.
Derek, while we have you here, are you getting any complaints as far as housing, people moving in fifth wheels and living in them permanently?
When we do, we go and investigate, and if we find that that is the case, then we notify the landowner. It's the responsibility of the landowner to vacate that unit. And whether it's the person living there or they're letting someone live there, it's not permitted except for under limited circumstances. So there is no permanent RV living unless you're in an RV park. But there are circumstances where you can, like say you're building your house, we can grant you a 6-month temporary thing, and then if you're going to be more than that, then it requires a conditional use permit, but it terms out at 12 months. But when we do get those complaints, we do go out and investigate and when we notify, but I haven't gotten anything recently. I mean, as in within the last month or so. But it's in this time of year, it starts to ramp up.
Sure. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Derek.
Mr. Chairman, before we move on from the commissioner updates, you said in your update, quote, "The state is putting forward an agenda without local input." I wonder if you'd share with us what the agenda is you're referring to.
The agenda issue is on the salmon recovery policy on the waterways without any input from the local counties. And then,
Is that the restocking of salmon in the upper part of the Columbia? Is it the culvert issue?
all the above. All the above. And I'd encourage you to get a hold of Wes McCart from Stevens County and Hill and get you all updated on it.
Yeah, I know Wes pretty well. I'm
Good.
just curious if this was on agendas or on the, the culverts that the state is legally obligated to fund and is not funding, or if it was on the Columbia River policy issue of restocking salmon upriver.
It's all the above. It's deals with Walla Walla, it deals with the Columbia River, it deals with all the waterways and the salmon recovery policy and what they're implementing without any local input.
Okay, thank
And
you.
then Keith, I've noticed that 2 emails, we got one person applying for planning and building board, the planning commission, excuse me, and we had one person apply for the veterans. Do we have positions open on the veterans board?
We are recruiting for a veteran service officer that we had talked about with.
Oh, is that the recruitment for the?
Yeah, and I think we may also have vacancies on the board itself.
Okay, I thought this was for a board member, and then I thought that we had one person apply for the planning and planning
I
commission?
think we have 3 applicants for the planning.
Good, good. So we're getting people to apply for that. All right, good deal. That's all I have to report. And next, we'll move down to the Hanford Communities, and we have David here. And welcome, David, and come on and give us a report.
Great, well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you all in person.
Good morning. This is the
Good
first
morning.
time you visited us in this boardroom, isn't it?
Yes, sir, I believe it is. It is. And this might be the first time I've seen Commissioner Mullen in person. Been in my video many times, but I don't know if we've seen each other in person.
Right.
But as Keith referenced earlier, I wear a couple of hats, and so I know all of you in different capacities, but with Chairman Didier on the Hanford Communities Governing Board, Commissioner Mullen on the TRIDEC Board, and then Commissioner Peck, we've worked closely on the shoreline reconveyance that Keith referenced earlier. But today I'm here wearing my Hanford Communities hat, and it's a pleasure to share with you an update on Hanford Communities and the Hanford site. And with that, I'll try to be fairly brief, but I wanted to kind of first frame kind of how Hanford Communities was formed. It was formed in 1994, and for those of us who lived in this community at that time, we recall that Hanford was just kind of transitioning into the cleanup phase of operations. There's still a lot of uncertainty and frankly a lot of distrust about the scope of cleanup, the risk to the community, and the local governments came together and said, we need to have a voice in the cleanup process, and we need to be better informed. And up to that point, all the jurisdictions were kind of doing their own thing, and it just wasn't efficient, the best use of resources, and so they formed Hanford Communities, and it operated under the city of Richland for most of that time period. But the objectives, as it says up there, were to coordinate the local governments, increase public awareness, advocate for the community's priorities, and then provide some level of technical and analytical resources to evaluate some of the issues at the Hanford site. And so we have 2 boards with Hanford Communities. We have a governing board, which sets policy for the organization, and that includes an elected official from each of the jurisdictions. And so as you can see here, we have Mayor Alvarez from Richland, Commissioner Delvin from Benton County, Commissioner Didier from here in Franklin County, Councilmember May Hayes from the city of West Richland, Commissioner Rasmussen from the Port of Benton, Councilmember Roach from Pasco, and then Councilmember Torelli from the city of Kennewick. And then the administrative board handles more of the administrative tasks associated with Hanford Communities, and so that's budget, managing a contract, which I'll speak to a little bit later, with the State Department of Ecology. And I should have said too, the governing board meets quarterly, and the administrative board traditionally meets twice a year. And so I wanted to share just a quick review of 2021. Some of the things that happened at Hanford, and it's all sort of framed in under the umbrella of COVID, and that certainly, like the rest of the world or our country and our state and our community, COVID did have some impacts at the Hanford site, but at the same time, I think there were some positive steps that were taken in the cleanup. But one thing that did get a fair amount of attention was a leak in tank B109, and as you probably know, there are, I think, 177 large underground tanks at the Hanford site. They can be anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million gallons. They're all buried underground. Some of them have been there since the 1940s during the Manhattan Project. And later on in the Hanford operations, they began building double shell tanks, which have a second shell to kind of contain the waste. But the single shell tanks are the ones that are the most concerned for leaking because there's no barrier between beyond that single shell. And they're also the older tanks. And B109 is one of those tanks. It's in the B farm area in what's called the 200 area of the Hanford site, right in the central plateau. And so DOE announced that B109 was leaking approximately 3.5 gallons per day into the soil. And I think for a lot of folks that was sort of alarming, but there's also some context that needs to be added to that as well. Back in the Manhattan Project era and the Cold War era, priority wasn't looking out for the environment. The priority was winning World War II and winning the Cold War. And in that effort, they dumped millions and millions of gallons of contaminated water into the soil in that same general area. And so 3.5 gallons a day, while not ideal, is not a significant additional insult to the environment in addition to what's already been done. And one of the challenges that we always have with the Hanford site, we hear the budget and it's almost $2.6 billion. That's a lot of money, of course. But the work is very challenging, it's very complex, and especially because of the safety issues, it can be pretty expensive. And so if DOE was to, say, do something to remove the waste from that tank or to put a cap on or to build a different tank to put the waste in, then that would divert resources from other priorities at the Hanford site. And I think in their judgment, and I would probably tend to agree, that that those resources are probably better used elsewhere. But the Department of Energy, along with the State Department of Ecology and EPA, are still actively negotiating on the path forward with B109. And I apologize for using acronyms, but I wanted to not have the bullet points filled up with just a lot of words. But the second bullet point, DF Law, that's the direct feed low activity waste facility, and then TSCR is the tank side cesium removal. And those are two really important facilities. So like I said, we have 177 tanks filled with waste. And the ultimate disposal method for much of that low activity waste is to put it through the direct feed low activity waste facility and vitrify it, meaning turning it into glass. And in order to do that, they first have to remove the cesium from the waste. And so those two facilities the construction was completed in 2021, and they began startup testing. They also treated over 2 billion gallons of groundwater. And I referenced earlier that there was millions and millions and probably billions of gallons of contaminated water that was dumped onto the ground in the history of Hanford's plutonium production mission. Well, now they're treating billions of gallons of that groundwater before it reaches the Columbia River. One of the other things that we've prioritized from Hanford Communities' perspective is risk mitigation. Some of you might remember a few years ago there was a lot of media attention when one of the Purex tunnels collapsed. And that's the wrong sort of attention that we want for our community. There were headlines all over the country about a nuclear waste tunnel that collapsed in Washington State or in the Tri-Cities, and the mayor of Kennewick at the time got a call from CNN asking how the evacuation was going. And so again, that's not the kind of attention that we want. But there are some real risks out there, and we feel like it's important that DOE proactively address those risks. And four of the main ones are PFP, the plutonium finishing plant. That was an extremely complex cleanup project. That's where the plutonium went at the end of its kind of production cycle to then be kind of packaged and shipped out to other sites. And so that project was completed. They got it torn down to the ground. The 324 building is just north of the Richland city limits and less than a mile from the Columbia River. And underneath that building, they found a very high level contamination spill. Thankfully, it is underneath a very large building, so it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But due to the high radioactivity as well as the proximity to the river and the city of Richland, that's been a priority to remove that contamination. WESIF is the waste encapsulation storage facility, and that facility holds about a third of the total curies at the Hanford site. It has cesium and strontium capsules, and if you walk into the room, they're all in a pool of water, and the pool actually glows blue because of the I think they call it Cherenkov glow.
Effect,
Yeah. And while there's no immediate risk from the way that the capsules are being stored now, if there was a beyond design basis event like a earthquake that dewatered that pool, then it would be what we call a bad day. It would create probably not any significant risk to the general public, but you probably couldn't fly planes above the Hanford site. And so the idea is in the next few years, to move those cesium and strontium capsules into dry cask storage, similar to how we store spent commercial nuclear fuel. And then the 100K area, that's where there are the K East and K West reactors, and it's again very close to the Columbia River, and they're the last two reactors that need to be cocooned or put into what's called interim safe storage. And so they did a lot of work to prepare the K Basin for cleanup, and then again the K East reactor for cocooning. On the policy side, and again I'll speak to this a little bit more later on, but one of the things that we're always mindful of is the long-term costs and timeline for Hanford cleanup, and if there's ways to safely expedite cleanup and reduce some of the costs. And one of those could be the high-level waste interpretation. That means basically you manage and treat the waste based on its physical characteristics rather than where it came from. Previously, DOE had managed it basically all as high-level waste, even if it was by physical constituency low-activity waste. They managed it as if it was high-level, and there's some costs and schedule slowdowns associated with that. And so during the Trump administration, the Department of Energy moved to begin managing waste based on its actual physical characteristics rather than where it came from. And the Biden administration affirmed that interpretation, meaning it's going to move forward, perhaps at the Hanford site in the future. So that we thought was a very good thing. One not really good thing was proposed elimination of PILT funding, payment in lieu of taxes. And so, as you all probably know, PILT is a program to reimburse or essentially provide some funds to local governments because they can't tax the federal government, they can't receive property taxes from the federal government. And I don't know, have the exact number, but I believe Franklin County receives just under $1 million in PILT funding every year. And that doesn't just go to the county, it mostly goes to libraries and veterans programs and hospitals and services for the public. But in previous years, the administrations have proposed budgets that would have effectively eliminated PILT funding, but what was different last year was it explicitly proposed eliminating PILT funding, both at the Hanford site and the Savannah River site in South Carolina. Now, thankfully, we have a congressional delegation who's on top of this, and that didn't ultimately happen, but it was concerning that it was so explicit in the effort to remove the PILT funding. And then the other big piece of policy was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. It doesn't appear that there's going to be a whole lot of crossover from that to the Hanford site, but that's something that we're looking at and seeing if there might be some opportunities, because it did provide the Department of Energy with $62 billion in additional funds. Also, the Integrated Tank Disposition Contract, or ITDC, the process for bringing that new contractor on board began in 2021. That new contract will operate both the tank farms at the Hanford site as well as the direct feed low activity waste facility. And then on the community engagement front, I mentioned that we received a grant from the Department of Ecology, and we used those grant funds to produce 3 videos, kind of short form videos, 5 minutes or less, to provide. The idea is that there's a lot of folks in our community who don't really live and breathe Hanford stuff, as much fun as it is. But they might see a headline in the newspaper and want to know a little bit more about it. And they can go to these websites and look at these videos and get a better understanding of Hanford 101 and some of the key issues like tank waste and the waste treatment plant, direct feed low activity waste facility. We also put together quarterly newsletters, blog posts that are shared on electronically, and then regular social media posts, again, in an effort to get the community engaged and to provide information. Looking forward to 2022, TSCR operations have begun. That's, again, treating the waste to remove the cesium before it goes through the direct feed low activity waste facility. I think close to 200,000 gallons have already been treated through the TSCR system. They will also begin melter heat up for the direct feed low activity waste facility. They'll continue the risk mitigation projects that I mentioned earlier. And then one of the other real opportunities that we see is the test bed initiative. I mentioned that with the direct feed low activity waste facility, a significant portion of Hanford's low activity waste will be vitrified, turned into glass, and then remain permanently on site at the Hanford site for forever. But the test bed initiative is looking at if it's possible to take some of that low activity waste and then grout it, mix it with concrete instead of turning it into glass, and then sending it permanently out of state, likely to Utah or Texas. And it has the potential to reduce some of the costs and to expedite the cleanup. And if it removes that waste from the tank sooner, then we think it's worth looking at. And so DOE is moving forward with what they call phase 2 of the test bed initiative this year. On the policy side, the DOE did produce an updated cost and schedule report, and in that they estimated that the timeline for active cleanup to be completed is 2078. So our kids and grandkids can go to work at Hanford and retire from there before cleanup is done. But the estimated cost, and the thing that really, if anything at Hanford kind of keeps me up at night, it would be the estimated costs of between $300 billion and $640 billion. At the high end, $640 billion, if you do the math, that would mean a budget of about $10 to $11 billion a year, every year for the next 50 or so years. And that's just not realistically achievable. And so we're faced with either an opportunity to look at opportunities to reduce the cost and the timeline, or extend the cleanup far beyond that 2078 timeframe, and probably the costs increasing far beyond the $640 billion amount. And so that's something that we're looking at, again, with the test bed initiative, the high-level waste interpretation, and other things as well. We're going to continue to share the importance of the payment in lieu of taxes. It's the right thing to do. If the government came, the federal government came and took land from local jurisdictions, and the local jurisdictions aren't able to receive any property taxes from that, then there should be some reimbursement and recognition of that situation. And then one other thing, just briefly mentioned, is consent-based siting. That's for our nuclear waste repository. The Tri-City area is unique across the country in that we have a large amount of waste that on the defense nuclear side at Hanford that should go into a deep geological repository like Yucca Mountain is the one that is the current law of the land, although nothing's really being done there. But we have the defense waste, but we also have a fairly significant amount of commercial nuclear waste from the Columbia Generating Station. And we need a place for that to go permanently. And so DOE is moving forward with a consent-based siting process to look for at least interim storage sites for some of our nation's nuclear waste. Our priorities: Hanford Communities Governing Board approves a issue agenda every year that identifies the organization's priorities. That may have been shared with you. If it hasn't, then I'd be happy to share. I'm sure, I know Commissioner Didier has seen it and was involved in formulating it. But we work to pursue the issue agenda every year, as well as we're very hopeful that things will move smoothly with the startup and operation of the direct feed low activity waste facility, continuing preparations to move the cesium and strontium capsules at the west of the facility into dry cask storage, work to continue to remove the high-level contamination underneath the 324 building. It's called the 300-296 waste site. The high-level waste interpretation, DOE has begun using that interpretation at Savannah River site. We're hopeful that they'll apply that here, at least in a small amount to begin with. The challenge there is that there are some watchdog organizations as well as tribes and especially the State Department of Ecology that are very skeptical of that approach, and so we're hopeful that we can find a way to move forward in a way that everybody can be comfortable with and at least explore where there might be opportunities with the interpretation. We want to try to continue to improve the Hanford regulatory approach. There's some challenges that I don't want to take too much time to go into, but with regulating the Hanford site, and then presumably later on this year, the integrated tank disposition contract will transition and that new contractor will come on board. And with that, that concludes my update. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Questions, commissioners?
So you mentioned the Hanford 101. Where can they find that information at?
So Hanford Communities has a YouTube page, and so it could, if you just went to YouTube and searched Hanford Communities, it would be on that, but it would also be on the website that conveniently is right here on the slide, hanfordcommunities.org. And if you went to that website, the videos are on there as well.
All right, thank you.
So, great presentation, thank you. I used to be on both those boards, the governing and the admin board, and that's probably the best and most cogent explanation I've seen for what we do. We should have done that years ago, but thanks for doing it. Well done. Just a few observations, and I learned this on the board that, as you alluded to, there are people in our community who have vast knowledge of Hanford. They've worked out there for 20 years and they know every inch. And there are others that have little concept of really what is there. And so one of the things that I have been sharing with people lately that has been kind of interesting is that we talk about the 100 area, the 200 area, the 300 area, and we use a lot of acronyms just like in my military days, and we leave people behind in the comprehension. So just wanted to share that, you know, the 100 area is that area on the north end of the Hanford Reservation where most of the plants were that were irradiating uranium-235, excuse me, which was being moved to the 200 area in the Central Plateau where it was extracted through Purex, the plutonium extraction, and through the PFP, the finishing plant, and that's where the actual 239 plutonium came from for the weapons. And that's in the central part where, coincidentally, the storage tanks are and where the VIT plant is being built, and it's kind of right in the middle of that, Hanford. And then lastly, the 300 area is right down on the north edge of town. And not to alarm anybody because it's all secure and it's being well managed, but the reference you made to the, I think it's cesium that we found under one of the research buildings and research labs is right there in the 300 area, just north of of Battelle, near the river. So there's a vast area, 500 some miles out there of areas. But that 100 area along the north end where the actual reactors were, if you fly over it or drive by it today, you notice that most of that's been taken down to ground level and cocooned. You mentioned Shrinkov, the Russian physicist, particles going through water, got to give up some energy somewhere and it glows blue. And anybody ever gets a chance to tour Columbia Generating Station during one of their refueling outages, you can sometimes get a chance to actually see that in person. It's remarkable. It's actually beautiful and scary at the same time. And then the last thing I just want to mention is you touched on Columbia's fuel, Energy Northwest nuclear power plant. Having worked there for several years a while ago, I once calculated if you took all of that waste or used fuel, we added up the dimensions of the 14-foot tall fuel rods and determined that you could take 25 years worth of fuel from that plant and fit it in a 7-Eleven. And if you were to recycle that fuel the way they do in France, you could fit it in the beer cooler of that 7-Eleven. And then lastly, too often in the nuclear power business, the electric generating business, it gets referred to as waste. But in fact, the fuel that goes into that reactor after being in there 6 years, when it comes out, still has 90+% of its energy potential remaining. And recycling that is something that was prohibited back when President Carter was in office. And since I've got a little tiny platform here, I'll just say it's time that America got back into the reprocessing business. So thanks for a great presentation.
So
It's
David,
good
I got a couple questions. You said they wouldn't be able to fly over Hanford. Why would that be?
So there's a lot of different types of kind of nuclear radioactive contamination. There's the kind that you might have at the plutonium finishing plant where it's particles of plutonium that especially it could be harmful if you breathe it in. But the cesium and strontium capsules, that's the type of radiation that the threat is if it's direct kind of line of sight to you, and it gives a direct kind of radiation exposure. And because the cesium and strontium capsules are so highly radioactive, even if you're flying above the site, you'd be at risk because if you were in direct line of sight to that that radiation.
The reason I asked that question is because people realize that there's only a waterway that separates it from Franklin County, and we have a lot of residents that are called downwinders. And would their line of sight be jeopardized?
No, so the cesium and strontium capsules aren't it's not the type of material where it will kind of fly away in the wind, like if there's a wind that catches it. That would be more of what they were concerned about with the plutonium finishing plant. And so it would be more of a, if the capsule was in the corner of the room and I was directly exposed to it, then I would be at risk. But again, the wind isn't going to carry that radiation over the river or beyond the Hanford site.
My other question is, and alluding to what Commissioner Peck said about the Columbia Basin Generation Plant, those fuel rods do have 94% after one burn. What is the status of FFTF? And that was built to clean and harvest, and I say harvest, the medical isotopes off of that could be utilized in a medical field of treating breast cancer and a cancer in men, prostate cancer, where you go after the cancer directly at the site instead of the evasiveness of what they're doing today with chemo and radiation. What is the status of FFTF, and could it be fired back up to clean these fuel rods? And just to let everybody know, once you clean that fuel rod and you use it again, you get it to a state of higher plutonium, correct?
Yes.
So just elaborate on that a little bit, where FFTF is and what happens if you keep using these fuel rods, and where you get to. You get to a state of plutonium that is used in the nuclear warheads, correct?
It could be, at least it goes in that direction, correct.
So what is the status of FFTF?
So there's a couple of schools of thought on FFTF. There's a lot of folks here in our community, as was referred to or referenced earlier, that are experts on FFTF and on nuclear issues and who worked out there when it was operational. And some of them would say that you could fire it back up. It would take a fair amount of work and investment to do it. I think one of the challenges is it was a molten salt reactor, and they drained the tubes that carried the molten salt, and by drilling holes into them. And so the challenge would be the safety protocols and the small capacity for error, I guess. There's a question as to could you kind of seal up those holes and reuse it, but I think some of those folks I've talked to have said, yeah, you absolutely could. I think it's a question that I think would require, and folks have looked into it before. Columbia Basin Consulting Group, which is a local company, has looked into that, and I think they concluded that it could be done. It would take significant investment, probably from the federal government to do so, and probably a lot of political support at the state and federal levels to do it, but it theoretically could. And to your question about waste, commercial spent fuel reprocessing, absolutely, it's the right thing to do. It was probably a political decision in the Carter administration, now 40-something years ago. And as Commissioner Peck referenced, that's how France does it. The concern that people do say about it is, as you indicated, Commissioner, that it can provide access to a little bit higher amount of plutonium than than normal spent fuel, but the non-proliferation processes that we can have in place and they have in place in France, I think, can easily deal with that. And when we look at the deep geological repository, again, whether it's Yucca Mountain or anywhere else, that's probably the most expensive real estate on planet Earth. The amount of study that has to be done, if we can reduce the volume of waste that has to go into that deep geological repository, as well as harness the tremendous amount of energy that's still left in the spent nuclear fuel, as well as reduce the total volume of waste, to me that's a win-win-win, and there's no reason why we shouldn't. Again, I think it takes some funding and political support probably at all levels, but I think between FFTF and potentially some of the other facilities there at the Hanford site, we could be very well positioned to do a lot of that work right here.
And is it true that there are a lot of fuel rods that are just stacked up around the reactor waiting for their destination?
Yes, sir.
And those could be immediately taken there and reused?
It's not really that far away. The FFTF is in the 400 area, just sort of right across the street from the Columbia Generating Station.
How long ago was it that they drilled the holes in that FFTF? That's been quite because I remember I conversed. Did you ever know Bob Schinter or Bob McCowan? Or John McCowan, excuse me. Bob Schinter or John McCowan. They were two guys that worked and constructed FFTF. They were very adamant and passionate about the usage of FFTF. They were the scientists that built it. They worked with us on the Fighting Children's Cancer Golf Tournament, which was, we were fighting for the medical isotopes to fight cancer in children instead of chemo and radiation. And they were very adamant in the effectiveness of those medical isotopes and being successful. And very upset when the government, it's been quite a while since they drilled those holes, correct?
I want to say it's been at least 20 years.
20 plus.
Yeah.
So I thank you very much for the presentation. Great job, and it's a pleasure working with you, David.
You as well. Thank you very much for having me.
Hey, Dave, would you just clarify one thing? There was a reference to fuel rods stacked up next to a facility. What fuel rods, what facility? I'm not aware of any fuel rods stacked up next to a facility. I don't want the public to get the wrong impression.
Sure, yeah, and I think the reference was to the spent fuel rods from the Columbia Generating Station.
Okay,
and
well, let me-
those are in...
Let me just clarify.
Okay.
Those are in 20-ton steel and concrete canisters in dry storage in a secure facility on a pad. Yeah, they're not stacked up. Just interesting side note, in 2008, we did a project working with French government to take all of that used, I don't call it spent fuel because it's 90+% potential still, but all that used fuel, and ship it down the Columbia River, stop in the old Trojan plant, pick up all of their used fuel, put it on a secure ship, and they're INF ships, ship it to France, recycle it into mixed oxide fuel, bring it all the way back to Columbia, and put it back into service and use it. And we calculated the cost of doing that was roughly equivalent to the cost of just going out and mining and making new fuel. So it's an interesting footnote on the fact that the reprocessing, if we had it in this country, would actually make it less expensive fuel, making power cheaper, and also further minimizing the environmental tail that comes with mining uranium. So I find that interesting.
Yeah, I think there's been a growing recognition that the United States has fallen behind in nuclear technology development, fallen behind Russia, fallen behind China, and there are geopolitical ramifications. And I think there's some desire in Congress and with the administration to change that. But even the current situation in Russia and the Ukraine, we're all familiar with the advanced reactor that will hopefully be built at Site 1 near the Columbia Generating Station. The initial source of that fuel is called high-assay, low-enrichment uranium. That was supposed to be Russia. And now there's a question as to, is that still the source? And if not, then internally and domestically we need to produce it, and we can. It's no technological challenge, but there's some questions as to the political willpower and the funds to do it, but you raised some really good points, and the way that I think the way that our society has viewed nuclear is, unfortunately, in communities like ours that are very familiar with it, there's not that fear or misunderstanding, but a lot of folks, when they think of nuclear, they think of Homer Simpson at the nuclear plant.
Well, we've had a vast influx of people to our community, and I think the percentage of people who are acquainted with Hanford and really know much about it as a percentage of the population is declining, which makes the work that you're doing even more important. And I'll just close with this public announcement, which is, if anybody's concerned about the used fuel stored out at Columbia, don't be. There's no functional way, realistically, that anyone could access that, and even if they could, there isn't anything weapons grade there for them to use, and it's just not a concern. So,
Absolutely.
Thanks.
So David, I would just say it's being stored on Hanford's site. And so, yeah, it's in some areas that are secure, but it's being stored on the Hanford site, and it could be reused. And when people think of nuclear, they think of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl.
Yes, sir.
And that's what scares them. And they don't realize that Chernobyl was cooled with graphite, not water. And there's a lot of things people don't know about nuclear that scares them. So I appreciate you again coming in here, and thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
So with that, we'll move down to, did I skip public comment? I guess I
I
did.
missed the first one, but.
So public comment, if there's anybody for public comment, is there anybody on the phone, Keith?
There was a gentleman waiting, but it looks like he's supposed to call back during
Okay.
the next session.
We'll do the public comment, and then we'll go into the vacation portion of Columbia Wood. Is there anybody in the room for public comment? Seeing none, we'll go into the vacation portion of Cottonwood Drive. Craig. And then we'll go to public comment again if he calls in.
Well, if it pleases the board, I'll give you a quick background on the matter. On March 14th, 2022, Public Works Office received a petition signed by 3 landowners adjoining to Cottonwood Drive requesting that a portion of Cottonwood Drive be vacated from milepost 4.24 to milepost 4.90. The petition was accompanied by a sufficient bond as required by law. Pursuant to 12.08 of the Franklin County Code, the board must consider if this portion of the road is useless and would benefit the public by its vacation and abandonment. In order to determine the usefulness of the road, a report by the county engineer is required. The board may or may not consider the petition. If the board chooses to consider the petition, they must direct the county engineer by resolution to investigate and report on the usefulness of said road in a future public hearing. I believe there was a map. If you want, I can put the area up on the screen, and I'd be happy to.
Yeah. While you're doing that, Craig, I move for approval of resolution 2022-069, the matter of vacation of a portion of Cottonwood Drive. That's the end of the motion, and I would just note that this is only step 1. It doesn't mean the road will be vacated. This is just to study it.
This is just to say, go look at it and come back with a report to you.
Second.
We have a motion and a second for the vacation of Cottonwood Drive, 4430 Cottonwood Drive. So Craig, how many houses are on this?
There were 3 landowners. I don't know how many houses. There's a lot of orchard ground, I believe.
And this is a gravel road?
Yes.
So that would take us off of maintaining it.
Yes.
We wouldn't have to run a road grader down there to
Yep.
maintain the road.
That would be one of the advantages of it and we'll look into
I
those
see
kind
only,
of items.
I see only one house, possibly 2 at the very end of it.
Yeah, there's not a lot. Most of it is controlled by the, oh, come on. Yeah, so you can see it's quite a lot of agricultural ground around the road. But we'll solicit from adjoining landowners and utilities that might be impacted by it. We'll look at any potential future expansion of the county road system that might be impacted by it, and things like that in the report. And generally, that'll take, from 8 to 12 weeks from now to accomplish, depending on when we get feedback from utilities and landowners. But we like to give ample opportunity for them to speak up.
All right.
Craig, your analysis will look not only at current use, but potential future need as a
Yes.
connector and
Right.
so forth. Okay,
That'd
great.
be one of the things that we'll look at to see if it has any impact on the future of the system.
Okay, thank you.
Any other discussion?
No.
Okay, we have a motion and a second for the vacation of Cottonwood Drive. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye to the motion.
Aye. All right, we'll move on down to the public comment. Is he on the phone now, Keith?
I don't see him yet on the phone, but he's hopefully calling in momentarily.
We could move on to closed session and then open it up for public comment after that if he calls in. Does that sound reasonable? Next, is there anybody else in the room for public comment? All right, with that, we'll move into closed session. Keith, you want to take us into closed session?
Yes, sir. I'm requesting a closed session under RCW. Let me interrupt myself. I just got notice that the gentleman is on the
Okay.
phone now. Would you want
bet.
to take public
Yeah,
comment?
let's take his call right now.
Okay, thank you. We'll surely go ahead and send him through. Good morning, David.
Yeah,
You are in the commissioner's room. You have 3 minutes for your public comment, please.
well, I'm looking at you live. Am I on now?
Yeah, there is a time delay between the live feed and what you're seeing on your screen.
Oh,
But your voice is
I
live.
didn't realize. I thought I was looking live. I'm a little bit delayed. Okay, well, we ready to go?
Yes, sir, please.
Okay, number one, I kind of got interested in the current meeting. I had a different comment unrelated to the meeting, but now I guess I got two comments on two different subjects. One with the Hanford stuff, and the other one with local school tax increases. I got the tax increase like everybody else, $1.75 per $100,000 assessed. The assessed values are all going up. 5,175 people voted yes, 4,304 voted no. That's 9,479 total, and the total cast was 10,473. So we're missing 994 votes. The vote passed. 23,000 people out of 42,000 registered voters did not vote. We've got the same tax increase lined up for 4 years in a row of $1.75 per 100,000. But the thing is it turns out that the pandemic aid relief bill that was passed by our government to pass out aid, COVID relief to schools, they passed out all that relief. You can look it up on the PDF file on the web. Pasco School District got a total of allocated $57 million. And yet, we all got told we got a shortfall to help the kids with school programs. So I think that matter needs to be looked into. 57 million is quite a bit. Kennewick got 58 million. So there's issues with that. We could drill down into that even more, but 67% of all the taxes collected are for the schools, so the tail's wagging the dog around here. Also talk about building another Chiawana school north on Road 100, which brings me to financing. The thing is, look, we got a 14%, 15% inflation rate right now. So you can do the math on that and see where we're going to be in the next couple of years. There's serious problems in Ukraine related to energy and fertilizer. They produce 70% of the world's fertilizer. I guess we're not going to have fertilizer this year. If we have a drought and no fertilizer, I guess that backs up why Biden's saying we're going to have food shortages. But the real issue is the money. The petrodollar basically died last week. When China is now going to, or when Saudi Arabia is going to sell oil in Chinese yuan instead of U.S. dollars, that's a death nail to the petrodollar. And the Russians gave us a finger. We're not going to purchase their oil. They're shaking hands with China. The economic system is really, really shaken. I'd like to go into that a lot more, but I'm going to advance to the current meeting. All the waste out at Hanford that has accumulated over the years doesn't seem to be moving around too much. It just still sits there. As I listen to people talk in this meeting, there's enough, I'd say, inadvertent misinformation to, kind of project towards, we got all these other future ideas, and eventually we got $300 billion we're going to have to spend. It's just a continuation of the same logic that we have a never-ending problem that needs funding. And years ago I suggested, and I'd even talked to some DOE people, in commercial nuclear power, where they have resin waste from cleaning up the water that cycles through the reactor, so they make steam. They've been getting rid of that crap for years. I mean, they just put it in. They put it in with mortar or concrete, more like mortar, and put it in a drum, and then it gets hard and it don't go anywhere.
David?
Classification is just a cute scientific endeavor to make something into a solid form that never goes anywhere. Well, the real issue is leaking right now. The leak rate, they say, is very low, 3.5 gallons.
David?
That's not,
David?
what can I say? That's not a way to describe the leak.
Excuse me, David?
Other comments made about
Can you not hear
U-235 and, uranium and cesium.
Hey, David, I need to interrupt you. We've exceeded the 3 minutes. Could you wrap up your comment, please?
Thank you.
Okay. I think they just need to put the stuff into solid waste, mortar it up, forget the whole thing. This is never going to get cleaned up. It's just ongoing, continuing dribbling over, hey, we got these big problems and we need more and more funding. We're not going to have the funding. The petrodollar is dead. Okay, we have serious problems with our own money system, and they're talking about numbers like $300 billion for this and that. It's not there. It's just not there. We're going into a whole new financial system. Everybody knows it. It's got a brain. And until that washes free, this is all hype.
Keith?
And the thing about cesium and uranium,
David, I apologize, but I'm going to need to cut you off. Thank you for your comment.
well, we'll talk again later. Is there another time to talk at the end of this meeting?
There will be another public comment at our next meeting on Tuesday of next week.
Where's that held?
It's in the Commissioner's Chambers in the Franklin County Courthouse.
Oh, in the courthouse. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, continue on. I mean, there's a lot to be said. I don't necessarily buy what's being said today about all the Hanford stuff. I mean, some of it I do, some of it I don't. So
Certainly. Thank you.
All right, Keith, take us into the closed session, please.
Yes, we're requesting a closed session under RCW 42.30.140, paragraph 4, subparagraph B, for collective bargaining. I would ask that the members of the board, myself, the clerk, the HR director, Eric Wyant, and the sheriff be allowed to participate in that discussion. Do we have a time, Eric?
15 minutes.
Up to 15 minutes, thank you.
Welcome. Now, please enter a meeting. If you are the meeting host, please.
Okay, are we good to go, Karen? Okay, we've come out of the closed session, and we have now moved into the administration office business. Keith, I believe you have at least one item.
I just have one item this morning, Mr. Chairman. It is the request for the support of the Board of Commissioners for a rural community development grant that we are applying for through the U.S. Department of Agriculture to assist us with our HVAC improvements in the public safety building. It's not a set amount. I think the amounts that they award are anywhere between $50,000 or $500,000. We expect this cost of this project to be $1.5 million approximately. We've approved that amount in the budget and anticipate using some ARPA funds for filling in what we don't get through other grants. But this is an independent grant through the Department of Agriculture we'd like to apply for. So I'm just looking for consensus from the board to support that with the...
This is that.
Hello?
Yeah.
Just asking for the board's consensus for the chairman to sign that letter on behalf of the commissioners.
Oh, is there a consensus from the board on this? Okay, we have consensus. And Keith, that's the only thing you had?
I believe so.
All right. So that concludes our agenda. Is there any other business for the good of the county? If not, this meeting is adjourned.